You, the anti-Hindu racist mafia, the New York Times, just dropped a salvo of anti-Hindu racist mafia disguised as journalism. The New York Times just dropped a salvo of anti-Hindu racist mafia disguised as journalism. The New York Times just dropped a salvo of anti-Hindu to shred the legitimacy of the indigenous Hindu sovereignty and sabotage the Hindu-indigenous alliances across the entire time. Let's take a look at the mouthpieces behind your disgrace. Mujib Mashal, born in Afghanistan and seasoned at the Qatar's Al Jazeera. Maria Silvia Trigo, peddling her leftist playbook from Bolivia, and Pragati KB, tethered to radical rags like The Hindu and The Dissent magazine. This rogue trio of these so-called social justice warriors, these hypocrites come together with one mission to attack the indigenous Hindu leadership and to erase our sovereign voice. The synchronicity is striking. Within hours of your hit piece, virtually identical articles appeared all over the world, such as Times of India, Hindustan Times, Republic TV, Times Now, and dozens of other outlets. Not a single fact was changed, not a comma was altered. Clearly evidences that this was a coordinated press release distributed globally to the anti-Hindu media network. This is not journalism, this is your distribution of the genocidal propaganda. What's more interesting is the partnership between the left and the right wing, the medias, to actually peddle these false narratives. Why this eerie unity between the left and right when it comes to attacking the indigenous Hindus? Well, the answer is very simple. Indigenous Hindu sovereignty is a ticking time bomb under the entire colonial deep state's throne, be it the right or the left. The left recoils at a free Hindu nation that defies their very grip, while certain right-wing gatekeepers clutch their monopoly on defining Hindu identity. You whisper Hindu next to sovereign and you see that these established lapdogs snap into attack mode, desperate to decredit it. Your calculated targeting of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, dragging him into agreements that he is not involved, lays bare the anti-Hindu racist news cartel's endgame. Not the truth, but a ruthless vendetta to crush the Hindu leadership, to block the resurgence of the indigenous traditions that dare defy your colonial overlords. This is not just an assault on Kailasa, it is your war on the religious liberty and the indigenous dignity, paving way for ethnic cleansing of Hindus. New York Times, your narrative actually collapses under the weight of your own contradictions. Your headlines declares that the Hindu nation was fake, but its land grabs in Bolivia was real. This paradox exposes your intellectual dishonesty. If Kailasa is fictional as you claim, how could it execute a real land transaction? If these were actual land agreements, then by the very definition of Kailasa cannot be fictional. Your propaganda apparatus cannot maintain logical consistency even with one single headline. What's even more revealing is your casual reference to, quote-unquote, 20 people associated with Kailasa being arrested for land trafficking. Now, this is a peculiar term that is invented for your hit piece. Yet, these supposedly, quote-unquote, arrested criminals were not prosecuted, they were not jailed in Bolivia, but they were simply sent back to their home countries, which is India, US, Sweden and China. Which legitimate criminal investigation ends with suspects being released to their home countries without charges, trials or extradition requests. This fabricated criminal narrative collapses under basic scrutiny, which is precisely why you, corporate colonial media, obsessively repeat the allegations while deliberately obscuring the outcome. No crime was committed, and that is the reason why no charges were pressed. You are not reporting, you are spinning a hate speech to fuel ethnocide. You go on to say that representatives of this non-existent country have given statements at the UN and posed for photos with global statesmen, American congressmen and the mayor of Newark. New York Times, your characterization of Kailasa as a non-existent country or a self-proclaimed nation represents a fundamental attack on the indigenous sovereignty and the self-determination rights that vest in us. This is not merely a semantic disagreement between two entities, but a calculated attempt by you, the fake news machine, to erase the existence of the indigenous Hindu communities worldwide with your hate-filled agenda. Let's address your colonial propaganda with facts. Point number 1. By what authority do you, the anti-indigenous colonial mouthpiece, New York Times, claim the power to recognize or de-recognize nations? Even the United Nations, by its virtue of its own declaration, it states that it is neither a state nor a government and does not possess any authority to recognize states. As an organization of independent states, it may admit new members, but it does not quote-unquote recognize nations as per their very own mandate. Furthermore, Kailasa fulfills all the criteria for statehood that is established as per the Montevideo Convention on the rights and duties of states. 4 major points. These are 1. Permanent population, 2. Defined territory, 3. Government, and 4. Capacity to enter into international relations. The Montevideo Convention explicitly states in Article 3 that the political existence of a state is independent of the recognition by other states. Article 13 of the Charter of the Organization of American States further reinforces the political existence of the state is independent of the recognition by other states. Even before being recognized, the state has the right to defend its integrity and independence. Kailasa's juridical statehood is a legitimate sovereign subject under international law. Kailasa is a sovereign subject under international law, possessing distinctive attributes derived from the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's inheritance of unbroken succession and the revival of 21 ancient Hindu sovereign states and ecclesiastical historical institutions. Your racist journalists' attempts to strip Kailasa of its rightful recognition demonstrates a very troubling disregard for the right to self-determination of the indigenous people, a right that is explicitly protected by the international law, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. You are the colonial mouthpieces of the deep state whose systematic campaign against Kailasa reflects your fear of the indigenous revival that threatens the very establishment of your power structure. Your real aim is blocking the indigenous Hindus from their rightful place with your genocidal media lies. You go on to place false narratives that Kailasa's leader, a fugitive holy man, known as Swami Nityananda, aka His Divine Holiness the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, and you go on to say that he fled India after being accused of rape, torture and child abuse. You hate speech mongers, New York Times, your vicious attacks against the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism reveals your systematic campaign of the religious persecution against the Hindu leadership, specifically the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism and the entire Hindu diaspora. Let's address your false allegations with documented facts one by one. First, the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is not a fugitive who fled India. He is a persecuted religious leader who has been systematically targeted through lawfare, and there are over 22 reports by the United Nations that very clearly recognize the persecution against the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism. Moving on to the next. In 2012, the Karnataka High Court declared the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's arrest as quote-unquote illegal, without any authority, contrary to law and without any jurisdiction, quashing the entire unlawful proceedings. In fact, the photographs of this very illegal arrest is used as the cover picture of your New York Times article, thereby using the photograph of persecution of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism to persecute the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism and his community even more. Moreover, the use of this photograph amounts to direct contempt of court, and I want you to mark that, New York Times. The next fact here that we are looking at is an Ohio federal court ruled in favor of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, fining the false rape accuser nearly $500,000 for defamation. Next, The medical examinations report conclusively. They demonstrate that the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's physical condition makes the allegations of rape biologically impossible. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism's testosterone was measured at 12.5 nanograms per deciliter. That's less than 6% of the minimum normal level. The next, on February 2nd, 2024, the Gujarat High Court completely exonerated the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism of all false charges of abduction and kidnapping. Moreover, multiple prominent human rights advocates, including Casey Jeffrey Robertson, who is a former UN Justice Council jurist, have documented the persecution of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism. And that is the reason, taking the response of Interpol has categorically refused any request to issue any notices against the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, recognizing the political nature of the persecution. You anti-Hindu deep state media deliberately suppress all these judicial exonerations, demonstrating your malicious intent to persecute the Hindu leadership. Your continued promotion of allegations, explicitly rejected by the courts worldwide, reveals that this is not journalism but a targeted religious persecution, a genocidal propaganda machine at work. The question remains, why do you corrupt media continue to promote all these allegations that are explicitly rejected by multiple courts? Well, the answer is very clear. Your agenda is not the truth but systematic persecution of the Hindu leadership to prevent the global revival of the indigenous Hindu traditions. You go on to claim that the officials in Bolivia said they had arrested 20 people associated with Kailasa, accusing them of land trafficking after they negotiated a 1,000-year deal with the indigenous groups in the Amazon. New York Times, let's be absolutely clear about a few things here. The agreements in question were between a US-based Hindu organization and the indigenous Bolivian communities. These are conservation partnerships that explicitly respect the indigenous sovereignty and their ownership. They are not land accusations or, as you allege, land grabs in any sense. The Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is not a signatory to any of these agreements, and by deliberately misattributing these agreements, you corrupt media reveal your intention to attack the entire Hindu diaspora. Let's look at what actually is there in those agreements. 1. Support for environmental protection and sustainable management. 2. Preservation of indigenous knowledge. 3. Humanitarian aid and development assistance. 4. Cultural exchanges and promotion of indigenous rights. Now, all of these agreements are in full compliance with the Bolivian law and the ILO Convention. This is endorsed by the indigenous leaders who retain sovereignty under Bolivia's constitution. Article 30 of the Bolivian Constitution explicitly guarantees the indigenous people the right to self-determination and territoriality. It further ensures the right to maintain their own institutions. Article 403 of the Bolivian Constitution states that the integrity of the indigenous territory is recognized, which includes the right to maintain, develop their own forms of economic, cultural, and spiritual life. Your characterization of the legitimate conservation partnerships as negotiation for 1,000-year leases for swathes of Amazon reveals your deep-stated colonial mentality. Why do your biased media believe that these constitutional rights apply to everyone except for indigenous Hindus and their partners? The implications are clear. You media mafia believe the indigenous community should only engage with the Western approved colonial partners. You are not journalists, you are racists, pushing a colonial agenda laced with hate speech. Furthermore, allegations that you place are the agreements were declared void and Kailasians were deported not to Kailasa but to the actual home countries. New York Times, here's the most revealing aspect of this entire fabricated controversy. See, if the individuals were truly arrested for the serious crime of land trafficking as you allege, why were they then simply deported back to their home countries, as you say, to India, US, Sweden and China, rather than being prosecuted under Bolivian law? Let's think logically for a moment. When someone commits an actual crime on the Bolivian soil, the standard legal procedure is to prosecute them in Bolivia, not to simply send them back home as you claim. What kind of criminal investigation ends with the suspects being released to their home countries without any charges or trials? This deportation without any prosecution conclusively proves that these were not criminal matters but politically motivated immigration maneuvers. This reveals your entire criminal narrative as a complete fabrication. No crime was committed, which is precisely why no one was charged with crimes. You, the establishment media, deliberately obscure this crucial fact because it completely destroys your false narrative of land grabbing and fraud. You go on to say that Nityananda was also grandiose, linking himself to long religious and royal lineages, and he claimed to have miracle powers. New York Times, the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, is the guru and is the sovereign of several indigenous lineages and traditions, wherein his succession as the Supreme Pontiff, as the Guru Mahasannidhanam, or as the Acharya Mahamandaleshwar is through Hindu apostolic and sovereign succession in several thousand years of unbroken lineages. For example, the Shamala Pita Sarvagnya Pitam is more than 5,000 years old, and the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is coronated as its 293rd Pontiff and Emperor. Likewise, the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism is the current Acharya Mahamandaleshwar of the similarly ancient Atal Akhada and is also appointed as the 1008th Mahamandaleshwar of the ancient Mahanirvani Akhada. The coronation of the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism to the spiritual sovereign thrones of these 21 sovereign kingdoms and ecclesiastical lineages was accompanied by various irrevocable coronation, nomination, and appointment deeds that makes this recognition legally binding. In 2015, the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, Bhagavan Sri Nityananda Paramashivam, was officially declared and coronated as the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism by over 1,000 spiritual leaders of Hinduism in a 3-day grand ceremony. Additionally, your bogus article is nothing but absolute fake news. You go on to falsely quote the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, making certain claims that he has never made. You post that the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism has claimed that during a conversation in front of a large group, he endorsed the idea of the world's first interlife reincarnation trust management. Really? Has your viewership gone so low that you resorted to these cheap tactics? I suppose that this proves why most of the people now label and mock you as the failing New York Times. Other allegations that you continue to place is that in 2023, a senior official in Paraguay resigned after he had signed a memorandum of understanding with Kailasa. And you go on to say that earlier that year, the mayor of Newark rescinded a sister city agreement with Kailasa. New York Times, our Hindu organizations engage with the indigenous communities worldwide. This is not a pattern of fraud, but a systematic commitment to global indigenous solidarity, cultural preservation, and mutual support between two persecuted communities. These engagements include humanitarian aid, cultural exchange, environmental conservation, and diplomatic relationship building. All standard international activities that you, the woke media, would never question the Western organizations. Your disinformation pipeline deliberately mischaracterizes legitimate diplomatic and humanitarian engagements as fraud or problems without providing any evidences of actual illegality or harm. Your vague references to similar issues in multiple countries mask the absence of any actual legal findings against the Hindu organizations in these jurisdictions. The allegation itself reveals your New York Times colonial mindset, that indigenous communities worldwide should remain isolated from each other, engaging only with colonial approved partners. Your concern is not about fraud, but about preventing the development of a global indigenous solidarity movement that could challenge the colonial power structures. Furthermore, you are the corrupt colonial media whose fixation on Hindu-indigenous partnerships while ignoring the systematic global exploitation of these indigenous communities by the extractive corporations reveals your selective concern. The real pattern of similar activities is colonial exploitation of indigenous lands that is being done worldwide by the very interests the legacy media outlets like you protect. You cover up for those elites. The question remains, why do you, the deep state media, uniquely scrutinize the Hindu organization's global indigenous engagement while accepting similar activities from colonial organizations as normal international relations? The answer is clear. Your agenda is maintaining the colonial control of the indigenous engagement, not protecting the indigenous communities. You go on to claim that in Bolivia, the Kailasa followers had arrived on tourist visa, managed a photo with the country's president, Honorable Luis Arce. You corporate corrupt media, New York Times, your snide insinuation that Kailasa's representatives somehow schemed their way into a photo with the Bolivian president is yet another pathetic stab by you. The dishonest press, such as you, to criminalize the legitimate diplomatic engagement. Let's start these lies with the facts. During the anniversary and celebration of the CIDOB, we were formally invited by them to join their commemoration. This is an official, above board invitation, and it is not some backdoor hustle. It was there in a very proper and a very respectful setting that we had the honor of meeting and gifting His Excellency President Arce a moment of diplomatic goodwill between the indigenous communities. We didn't bargain, we didn't violate a single rule. This was a sanctioned engagement, plain and simple. Once again, the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism wasn't even present, a fact that you biased media grudgingly admit but twist it to imply some shadowy deceit. This is your misinformation empire at work, smearing lawful Hindu indigenous solidarity as suspicious while ignoring the selective outrages of the deep state mouthpieces like you, New York Times. New York Times, you corporate media, including colonial lapdogs like Eldaber, have the gall to cry scandal over conservation agreements between indigenous groups while turning a blind eye to the real crooks, the mining mafia, the extractive industries, who strong-arm the indigenous people into shady coercive deals to plunder their lands. You, the same hypocrites, stay silent when the real land grabbers exploit the resources, but the second indigenous nations like the Bores sign legitimate partnerships with Hindu organizations, your misinformation empire slithers out, shrieking exploitation and deception. It's a sick double standard that you fellows play. You prop up the deep-pocketed destroyers of indigenous heritage, then feign outrage when the conservation deals threaten your colonial cronies' profit. The indigenous leaders are being strong-armed and brainwashed by the true culprits, the mining mafia and their deep state mouthpieces such as you, who now masquerade as protectors, pressuring them to ditch their partnerships by convincing that they are dupes. You, the biased media, aren't exposing a scandal, you are running a cover for the real exploiters while sabotaging the indigenous sovereignty and the solidarity with your hate-filled lies. New York Times, your sustained campaign against Kailasa and the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism exposes your role as a hate speech. New York Times, your sustained campaign against Kailasa and the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism exposes your role as a hate speech monger who is perpetuating colonial narratives aimed at maintaining control over indigenous communities worldwide. Every single article labeling Kailasa as fictional, every false allegation aimed at indigenous Hindu collaboration serves your singular purpose of reinforcing your colonial power structure, enabling the ongoing exploitation of the indigenous lands, resources, and cultural heritage. This is not journalism. It represents your media-facilitated colonization and cultural annihilation, laying the groundwork for the entire Hindu genocide. Your strategy is clear. Demonize indigenous leaders challenging colonial interests, delegitimize their organizations and institutions, and cultivate public acceptance for increased persecution. History repeatedly reveals similar tactics that are being employed against the indigenous communities, and now they are being disguised under your sophisticated facade of investigative journalism. We demand and urge that you immediately cease this discriminatory and prejudiced campaign and recommit to ethical journalism and run an unambiguous apology for inciting genocidal hate against the Hindus, the Supreme Pontiff of Hinduism, and Kailasa.